The first
That
thing he
moment on
heard
the
was the
stairs.
crack of
What did
bone
you
against
see?
tile,
I don't
sharp
know.
enough to
Felt
echo through the
blurry.
hallway
have to
before the
remember.
scream could form. It wasn't a cinematic sound. It was wet and blunt, like something heavy dropped from a careless height. Daniel was still holding his phone when he saw her body at the bottom of the stairs, twisted at an angle that made his mind refuse to understand what his eyes were reporting. For half a second he thought she had tripped. For another half second he believed she would move. Then he saw the way her head rested against the wall, too still, too final, and he realized the silence after impact was louder than the fall itself. "I didn't push you," he said, though she hadn't accused him yet. The words slipped out like a reflex, as if language could reverse physics. He dropped the phone and ran down the stairs, two at a time, knees shaking, not from grief, but from something uglier. When he reached her, he didn't touch her at first. He crouched and studied her face, waiting for the twitch, the blink, the furious inhale that would allow them to resume their argument. Instead, there was a thin line of blood threading from her temple toward the grout. He finally pressed his fingers against her neck. He had seen it done in movies. His hands were cold, and he couldn't tell if the faint tremor he felt was her pulse or his own. "Maya," he whispered, then louder. "Maya, answer me." He wanted her to be angry. He wanted her to sit up and call him manipulative, call him controlling, say all the words she had been holding in her throat for weeks. Instead, she lay there as if she had already decided not to participate in whatever came next. The memory of the last thing he said to her came back with merciless clarity. "You don't get to walk out like this." That was the sentence. Not "I love you," not "wait," not "please," just a command disguised as fear. He had reached for her wrist when she tried to move past him. He remembered that much. He remembered the heat in his chest and the certainty that if she left now, she would not come back. What he did not remember, or refused to admit remembering, was whether his hand had tightened. His phone buzzed on the steps above them, vibrating against wood in frantic pulses. Someone was calling. He stared at it like it was an accusation. He could say she slipped. The stairs were narrow. The railing had been loose for months. He had meant to fix it. He had meant to fix many things. He pressed his fingers harder into her neck and finally felt something steady and weak beneath the skin. Relief did not come as comfort. It came as terror. If she lived, she would speak. He dialed emergency services with hands that felt detached from his body. His voice sounded wrong, as if someone else was using it. "My wife fell," he said, and the lie was so smooth it frightened him. "She fell down the stairs." The operator asked questions. He answered automatically. Conscious, breathing, bleeding. He kept his eyes on Maya's face as he spoke, studying the possibility of her waking up mid-sentence and contradicting him. She didn't. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with efficiency that bordered on indifference. One of them knelt beside her and shone a light into her eyes. "How did it happen?" the woman asked without looking up. Daniel repeated the story. There was a pause, slight but noticeable. "Were you with her when she fell?" the paramedic asked. He hesitated, for less than a second. "Yes," he said, then corrected himself. I was right behind her." The adjustment sounded worse than the original. They lifted Maya onto a stretcher, securing her neck, strapping her wrists. Daniel noticed how fragile she looked once she was restrained. Smaller than he remembered. As they carried her out, her hand brushed against his leg. He felt the contact like a burn. It would be easy to interpret that touch as accidental. It would be harder to ignore the memory of her trying to pull away from him just minutes earlier. At the hospital, fluorescent lighting flattened everything into harsh truth. He sat in a plastic chair outside the trauma room and replayed the scene over and over, searching for the exact second where intention became force. Did he shove? Did he just block her path? Did she lose her footing because she twisted too hard trying to free herself? The difference mattered legally. Morally, he suspected it did not. A nurse approached him with a clipboard. "We need some information," she said gently. He provided her name, age, medical history. When she asked if there had been any recent conflicts or unusual behavior, he almost laughed at the understatement. "We argued," he said instead. "About what?" The question was casual, but he felt its weight. "About her leaving," he admitted. "Leaving the house?" "Leaving me." The nurse's pen paused. She didn't react dramatically. She just nodded and continued writing. That quiet acknowledgement felt worse than outrage. It suggested pattern. It suggested context. He suddenly realized that the story of tonight did not begin at the top of the stairs. It began months ago, maybe years, in smaller moments where he tightened his grip on conversations, on decisions, on her. He leaned back and closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no escape. He remembered the first time she told him she felt trapped. They had been in the kitchen, She was washing dishes, her back to him. "I feel like I need permission to breathe," she had said. He had responded with wounded disbelief. "I do everything for you," he had insisted. "How can you say that?" The conversation ended with her apologizing for being ungrateful. When the doctor finally came out, his expression was professionally neutral. "She has a severe concussion," he began. "There's also a fracture to the temporal bone. We're monitoring for internal bleeding." Daniel focused on the medical terminology, as if it were a foreign language he could hide inside. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked. The doctor hesitated just enough to remove certainty. "We won't know for at least 24 hours. Will she remember what happened?" The question escaped before he could stop it. The doctor studied him for a moment. "Memory loss is possible," he said, "but there's no way to predict the extent." Daniel nodded slowly. Part of him prayed she would forget. Part of him feared that if she did, he would have to live with the only intact version of the truth. Hours passed in a blur of antiseptic smell and mechanical beeps. Around 3 a.m, he was allowed to see her. She lay in a bed, surrounded by monitors, her head wrapped in white bandage that made her look smaller still. He pulled a chair close and sat down. "You scared me," he said softly, the words rehearsed for when she opened her eyes. "You slipped. I tried to grab you." He studied her face for signs of recognition. There were none. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "You know I would never hurt you," he whispered. It was unclear whether he was trying to convince her or himself. The silence did not argue back. As dawn crept through the hospital blinds, a police officer stepped into the room. He was young, his uniform crisp, his expression cautious. "Mr. Hale?" Daniel nodded. "We just need to ask a few questions," the officer said. Daniel felt his pulse accelerate, but he forced himself to remain seated. "Of course," he replied. "Anything." They stepped into the hallway. The officer's tone was polite but firm. "We received a call from a neighbor earlier this week," he began, "about loud arguments." Daniel's throat tightened. He had forgotten about the neighbor. "We argue sometimes," he admitted. "It's normal." The caller mentioned hearing something break, the officer continued. Daniel remembered the shattered picture frame. He remembered throwing it, not at her, but near her. The distinction felt flimsy now. "Did you make physical contact with your wife before she fell?" The question arrived without preamble. Daniel felt as if the hospital corridor had narrowed. "I tried to stop her from going down the stairs," he said carefully. "I grabbed her arm." The officer held his gaze. "Did you push her?" Daniel opened his mouth and found that the answer was not a single word but a maze of justification. "I don't think so," he said finally. The uncertainty was honest. That honesty sounded incriminating. The officer scribbled notes. "We'll need a full statement later," he said. "For now, just stay available." Daniel nodded. As the officer walked away, Daniel realized that the version of events he chose would solidify into record. Once spoken, it would no longer belong solely to him and Maya. It would become evidence. He returned to her room and sat down again. Her eyelids fluttered briefly, and his heart leapt. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bed. "Maya," he said urgently, "can you hear me?" Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused. She looked at him as if he were a stranger at the foot of her bed. "Daniel?" she murmured, confusion threading through her voice. "I'm here," he said quickly. "You fell. You slipped on the stairs." He watched her expression, searching for contradiction. She blinked slowly. I remember yelling," she said faintly. His stomach tightened. "We were arguing," he acknowledged. "You lost your balance." He delivered the narrative with steady calm, hoping repetition would shape memory. Her brow furrowed. "Did you?" She stopped mid-sentence, pain flickering across her face. He leaned closer. "Did I what?" he asked. Too fast. She closed her eyes again. "Nothing," she whispered. The monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, indifferent to the question left hanging between them. He sat back and felt the weight of that unfinished sentence settle into his chest. If she remembered, even partially, there would be no simple path forward. If she didn't, he would be the sole guardian of what truly happened. In both scenarios, the burden did not lighten. It shifted, expanded, tightened around him. He reached for her hand and held it gently, careful not to apply pressure. "We're going to get through this," he said. The words sounded like a promise. They felt like a threat, because getting through it would require one of them to surrender something irretrievable. And as he watched her breathing steady beneath the fluorescent lights, he understood that survival might not be the most painful outcome. She drifted back into unconsciousness, her fingers loosening in his grasp. He did not release her hand immediately. He needed the physical proof that she was still there. that whatever had happened on the staircase had not already rewritten him into something unforgivable. The monitors hummed with mechanical patience, recording every fragile beat of her heart, as if the room itself were documenting evidence. He leaned closer to her and lowered his voice, careful not to trigger the nurse stationed behind the glass partition. "You were furious," he whispered. "You said you couldn't do this anymore." He paused, listening to the soft exhale of her breath. "You were going to leave." The word leave sounded heavier now. It carried consequence. If she left him, he would be alone. If she accused him, he would be something worse than alone. The door opened softly. It was her sister, Evelyn. Daniel stiffened before he even turned around. Evelyn had always seen through him in a way Maya never fully allowed herself to. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight but controlled. She stepped closer to the bed, ignoring Daniel entirely at first. "Is she conscious?" "She woke up briefly," he replied. His tone was measured, rehearsed. "She doesn't remember much." He watched Evelyn's reaction carefully, her jaw clenched. "What do you mean she doesn't remember much?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "She's concussed. The doctor said memory gaps are possible." He delivered the medical explanation as if it were a shield. Evelyn finally looked at him. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment. "And how did she fall?" she asked. There it was. The question everyone would eventually circle back to. "She slipped," he said evenly. "We were arguing. She tried to storm past me. The railing is loose." He kept his eyes steady. He had practiced this version in his head enough times that it almost felt true. Evelyn stepped closer until they were nearly shoulder to shoulder. "You grabbed her," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel felt a prickle of heat crawl up his neck. "I tried to stop her," he corrected. "I didn't want her to leave in that state." Evelyn's lips tightened. "You don't get to decide what state she's in." He swallowed. "I didn't push her." The words came out sharper than intended. Evelyn didn't flinch. "You don't sound sure," she replied. That single observation unsettled him more than any accusation would have. She moved to the other side of the bed and took Maya's hand, replacing his without asking. The gesture felt territorial, protective. Daniel stepped back, suddenly unsure where he was supposed to stand. The room no longer felt like neutral ground. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. "She told me she was scared of you," Evelyn said, without looking at him. The sentence landed like a blunt instrument. "She was exaggerating," Daniel insisted. "We fight. Everyone fights." Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on her sister. Not everyone ends up at the bottom of a staircase. The nurse stepped in then, gently reminding them to keep their voices low. Daniel nodded, grateful for the interruption. He moved toward the window and stared out at the gray morning sky. The city outside looked indifferent. Cars moved. People crossed streets. No one else's life had cracked open in the past 12 hours. Evelyn spoke again, softer this time. "When she wakes up fully, I want to be here." Daniel turned. "I'm her husband," he said. The title felt like authority. Evelyn finally met his eyes. "Then act like one." He left the room under the pretense of getting coffee. In reality, he needed distance from her scrutiny. The hospital corridor felt longer now. Each step echoed faintly against polished floors. He replayed Evelyn's words. "She told me she was scared of you." He tried to pinpoint when that shift had occurred. When did concern become fear? He had never hit her. Not once. He had never raised a fist. He had only raised his voice. In the cafeteria, he stared at the vending machine without seeing it. He remembered the night 2 months ago when Maya had packed a suitcase for the first time. She hadn't left then. He had apologized. He had cried. He had promised therapy, patience, change. She had unpacked quietly, folding her clothes back into drawers. He had felt victorious that night, though he masked it as reconciliation. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from the police officer. "We'll need you to come down to the station this afternoon for a formal statement." Daniel read it 3 times. He typed back a brief acknowledgement. There was no avoiding it. The narrative would have to solidify soon. When he returned to the room, Evelyn was sitting rigidly in the chair he had occupied earlier. Maya's eyes were open again, clearer this time. Daniel felt a flicker of hope mixed with dread. "Hey," he said gently, stepping closer. "How are you feeling?" She looked between him and her sister, as if comparing 2 separate realities. "My head hurts," she murmured. Her voice was hoarse. "What happened?" Daniel opened his mouth, but Evelyn spoke first. "You fell down the stairs," she said carefully. She did not elaborate. She did not mention argument or grip or railing. She simply presented the event. Maya frowned slightly. "I remember yelling," she said again. "I remember you grabbing me." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He forced a small, reassuring smile. "I was trying to steady you," he interjected. "You were moving too fast." He leaned closer, lowering his tone. "You slipped." Maya's eyes searched his face, not for comfort but for alignment. "Did you push me?" she asked quietly. The room seemed to shrink around the question. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "No," he said firmly this time. "I would never push you." He held her gaze, willing her to accept the certainty in his voice. Evelyn's silence was louder than any objection. She watched the exchange with restrained fury. Maya closed her eyes briefly, as if testing the weight of her own memory. "I don't know," she whispered. "It's blurry." Daniel exhaled slowly. Blurry could be shaped. The doctor entered shortly after, explaining the need for further scans and observation. As they prepared to wheel her away, Maya's hand tightened around Evelyn's. She did not reach for Daniel. He told himself that was because of pain, because of confusion, not because of distrust. Hours later, sitting alone in the hospital parking lot, Daniel realized that the version of events now existed in 3 separate minds. His, Maya's, Evelyn's, and soon, the police would add theirs. Truth was no longer a single thread. It was a fraying rope. At the station, the interview room felt colder than the hospital. The officer from earlier sat across from him with a recorder placed carefully between them. "For the record, please state your full name," he began. Daniel complied. The questions followed a predictable pattern at first. Time of argument, nature of conflict, physical contact. "Did your wife attempt to leave the residence?" the officer asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "Did you attempt to prevent her from leaving?" "I asked her to stay." "Did you physically restrain her?" The word restrain felt deliberate. "I grabbed her arm," Daniel admitted. Briefly, the officer nodded slowly. "Were you angry?" Daniel hesitated. Honesty could sound dangerous. "Yes," he said finally, "but I didn't intend harm." The officer leaned back. Intent and outcome don't always align. Daniel felt the room closing in. "She lost her balance," he insisted. "I tried to catch her." "Did you catch her?" "No." The simplicity of the answer felt damning. When he left the station, the sun was already setting. The sky burned orange over the horizon, indifferent to his unraveling life. He drove home for the first time since the fall. The house looked exactly the same. The staircase stood in silent accusation. He walked slowly to the top and stared down. The distance was not enormous. It was not cinematic. It was ordinary. He tried to recreate the moment. He stood where she had stood. He imagined her twisting away from him. He reached out with his hand, stopping just short of the air where her wrist would have been. "I didn't push you," he said aloud, testing the sound in the empty house. The words echoed faintly. But memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, and each time he replayed it, the edges shifted slightly. He remembered the heat of her skin under his fingers. He remembered the way she yanked her arm. He remembered a sudden forward motion. What he could not isolate was force. Did he apply it, or did she generate it in resistance? The distinction felt microscopic and enormous at once. He noticed the railing and pressed against it. It wobbled slightly. Not enough to collapse. Not enough to absolve him. He tightened the screws with a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. The action felt futile. Repairing the railing did not repair the past. That night he slept on the couch, though there was no one to object to his presence upstairs. He dreamed of the fall repeatedly. In one version, she slipped on her own. In another, he shoved her deliberately. In a third, she turned to face him mid-fall, her expression not fearful but disappointed. He woke before dawn, heart racing. The dream clung to him like residue. He checked his phone immediately. No new messages from the hospital, no accusations, just silence. When he returned to Maya's room the next morning, Evelyn was gone. Maya was awake, staring at the ceiling. "You came back," she said softly. The phrasing unsettled him. "Of course I did," he replied. "Where else would I be?" She turned her head slowly to look at him. There was something different in her gaze now. Not accusation, not forgiveness, something analytical. "I keep trying to remember the exact moment," she said. "Right before I fell." Daniel sat down carefully. "You were angry," he said. "You weren't watching your step." She studied him. "I remember you saying, 'I don't get to walk out like this.'" His breath caught. "I was upset," he admitted. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." She held his gaze longer than he expected. How did it sound? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He could not answer that without exposing more than he intended. "Like I didn't want you to leave angry," he said finally. It was partially true. She looked away. "I don't know if I slipped," she murmured, "or if something else happened." Daniel felt his pulse spike again. "What do you mean something else?" he asked, too quickly. She winced at the sharpness in his voice. I mean, I can't tell if I lost my balance or if I was pulled. The word pulled hung between them like a suspended verdict. He leaned forward, lowering his tone deliberately. Maya, listen to me. I would never hurt you. He repeated it slowly, as if repetition could imprint certainty. She closed her eyes again. I want to believe that, she said. The phrase was not the same as belief. It was an admission of desire. He reached for her hand once more. This time she did not pull away, but she did not squeeze back either. The space between their fingers felt wider than the hospital bed. He realized then that even if she forgot the mechanics of the fall, she would not forget the months leading to it. The fear Evelyn mentioned, the suitcase, the apologies. Outside the room, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Somewhere, a child cried. A machine beeped insistently in another ward. Life continued at indifferent pace. Inside, Daniel understood that the question was no longer only whether he pushed her. It was whether he had been pushing her for years in ways that left no visible bruises. He leaned back in the chair and watched her breathing again, steady but shallow. If she chose to remember him as a man capable of violence, that identity would attach to him permanently. If she chose to believe his version, the guilt might still rot him from the inside. There was no path that left him untouched. Maya opened her eyes once more and spoke quietly, almost to herself. If I can't remember, how do I know what's true? Daniel felt the weight of that question settle into the room like a third presence. He realized he had been asking himself the same thing since the moment her body hit the tile. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. We decide what's true, he said carefully. We piece it together. Even as he spoke, he understood how dangerous that statement was. Truth shaped by convenience was not truth. It was construction. Maya studied him in silence. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not clarity. Not yet. But something shifting. And Daniel understood with growing dread that whatever version of events she eventually chose to inhabit would determine not only their future, but the kind of man he would be forced to see in the mirror. She kept looking at him as if she were measuring something invisible between them. Not distance, not affection, something more structural. What if my memory comes back all at once? She asked quietly. What if it's not the version you're telling me? The question was calm. That calm unsettled him more than hysteria would have. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together so she would not see them tremble. Then we deal with it, he said. He tried to sound steady, reasonable, like a partner ready to face consequences. I'm not afraid of the truth. The lie tasted metallic. He was afraid of one specific version of it, the one where his grip had been firm enough to redirect her balance. Maya shifted in the bed and winced. Evelyn thinks you're hiding something, she said. The words were almost casual, as if reporting the weather. Daniel felt a flash of irritation rise in his chest. Evelyn has always hated me, he replied. She's protective. She sees danger where there isn't any. He paused, studying Maya's face. Do you see danger? She didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the thin hospital blanket covering her legs. I saw something in your face that night, she said slowly, before I turned away. His throat tightened. What did you see? He asked. Softer now. I don't know, she admitted. That's the problem. I can't label it. It wasn't just anger. She closed her eyes briefly, as if replaying an image. It was like you couldn't accept that I was leaving, like the idea itself offended you. Daniel felt exposed. That was accurate. The idea had offended him. It had felt like betrayal, even though she had warned him for months that she was suffocating. I didn't want you to walk out while we were fighting, he said. That's all. He knew it wasn't all. He had wanted control, not dominance in the physical sense, but in the narrative sense. He had wanted to be the one who decided when a conversation ended, when a relationship paused, when reconciliation occurred. She studied him again. Did you ever think about what would happen if I actually left? She asked. Every day, he admitted before he could stop himself. The honesty startled them both. And what did you think would happen? Her tone was not accusatory. It was analytical. I thought I would lose everything, he said. He realized how self-centered that sounded. Not I would lose you, not we would break apart, just I would lose everything. She caught it too. Her gaze sharpened. Everything? She repeated. He looked away briefly. The house, the routine, the life we built. He didn't mention reputation. He didn't mention how their friends saw them as stable, as solid, as enviable. He didn't mention how he feared being the man whose wife left him because she was afraid. Maya let out a slow breath. You didn't say you'd lose me, she observed. The air in the room felt thinner. You're not an object I own, he replied quickly. I can't lose you like property. The phrasing was awkward, defensive. She noticed. You talk about control without using the word control, she said quietly. That's what scares me. He felt irritation flare again, but this time he forced it down. Anger would only confirm her suspicion. I'm not controlling, he insisted. I need things to make sense. He realized that sounded worse. She looked toward the window. Sunlight cutting across the sterile room. When I packed my suitcase that first time, she said, you cried so hard I thought you were going to collapse. I felt guilty for hurting you. So I unpacked. She turned back to him. But the next day, you acted like I had threatened you. He remembered that day vividly. He had been distant, cold, punishing her subtly for daring to test the possibility of leaving. I was scared, he said. Fear makes people defensive. She nodded slightly. Fear also makes people dangerous. The word dangerous settled between them like a verdict waiting to be signed. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice again. Do you think I'm dangerous? He asked. He needed to hear her say no. He needed it more than he needed oxygen. She didn't respond immediately. Her silence stretched, filling the room. I think you don't like losing, she said at last. And I think you don't know what you're capable of when you feel cornered. The sentence wasn't shouted. It was delivered like a diagnosis. He felt his chest tighten. I would never intentionally hurt you, he repeated. He noticed he kept adding the word intentionally, as if carving out a loophole. She noticed too. But you might accidentally hurt me if you're trying to keep me, she said softly. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the memory of her arm in his grip surfaced again. The sudden forward motion. The split second where he prioritized stopping her, over stabilizing her. He had not thought about gravity. He had thought about possession of the moment. The door opened again. This time it was the doctor, accompanied by a social worker. Daniel's stomach dropped. The social worker's smile was professional, practiced. We just want to check in, she said gently. After traumatic events, it's common for underlying relationship dynamics to surface. The phrasing was careful but pointed. They asked Maya a series of questions. Did she feel safe at home? Did she feel pressured or controlled? Daniel sat rigid in his chair, listening as his marriage was reduced to a checklist. Maya answered cautiously. I don't know, she said more than once. I'm confused. The social worker turned to Daniel. Sometimes confusion can be protective, she said evenly. Memory blocks can shield someone from confronting something painful. He nodded slowly, unsure whether that was reassurance or warning. When they left, the room felt heavier. Maya looked exhausted. I don't want this to become a case study, she murmured. I just want to know what happened. Daniel reached for her hand again, and this time she pulled it back slightly before allowing contact. The hesitation was small, but unmistakable. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned with a bag of clothes and a rigid expression. She looked at Daniel like someone evaluating a suspect. I talked to the officer, she said without preamble. Daniel felt a spike of alarm. Why? He asked. Because I want clarity, she replied. You've changed your wording twice already. His jaw tightened. I haven't changed anything, he insisted. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. First you said you were behind her, then you said you were trying to catch her. Now you're saying you grabbed her arm briefly. Which is it? Maya watched the exchange silently. Daniel felt cornered. I was behind her, he said. I grabbed her arm to stop her from storming off. She twisted away. She slipped. The words felt rehearsed now, less spontaneous each time. Evelyn crossed her arms. Or you held on too long. The accusation hung in the air. Daniel stood abruptly. I didn't push her, he snapped. The volume surprised even him. Maya flinched. The reaction was small, but it was there. That flinch did more damage than any verbal accusation. Daniel froze. I'm sorry, he said quickly, lowering his voice. I didn't mean to raise my voice. He felt exposed, as if his own body were betraying him. Maya looked at him steadily. You see how fast it happens? She asked quietly. How quickly you go from calm to sharp. He felt shame creep up his spine. I'm under pressure, he argued weakly. Anyone would be. Evelyn shook her head. Not everyone has their wife in a hospital bed because of an argument. The bluntness sliced through him. He wanted to shout. He wanted to defend himself. Instead, he sat down slowly, aware that every reaction was being recorded in memory. That night, after visiting hours ended, Daniel walked back into the house alone again. The silence was suffocating. He stood at the bottom of the stairs this time, looking up. The angle from below felt different, more dramatic. He imagined her falling again, but from this perspective, he saw himself at the top, hand outstretched. He tried to remember the exact pressure in his fingers. He squeezed his own wrist experimentally, measuring force. It would not take much, just a slight imbalance, a moment of resistance. The body does the rest. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He began searching phrases he had never typed before. Accidental push downstairs, domestic dispute memory loss, concussion, unreliable witness. Each search result felt like both lifeline and indictment. He closed the laptop abruptly. This was not strategy. This was panic. He leaned back in his chair and covered his face with his hands. "I didn't mean to," he whispered into the empty room. The sentence felt closer to truth than his previous denials. The next morning, Maya requested to speak to the officer alone. Daniel learned this from a nurse who avoided eye contact. His heart pounded as he waited in the hallway. He imagined every possible version of what she might say. He imagined her accusing him directly. He imagined her saying she wasn't sure. He imagined her protecting him out of habit. When the door finally opened, the officer stepped out with a neutral expression. "We'll be in touch," he said. Daniel searched his face for clues and found none. He entered the room cautiously. Maya looked drained. "I told them I don't remember clearly," she said. Relief flooded him so quickly he almost felt dizzy. "Thank you," he said before thinking. She noticed. "I didn't do it for you," she added quietly. "I did it because I can't accuse someone of something I can't see in my head." The distinction mattered. He nodded slowly. "I understand." She watched him for a long moment. "Do you?" she asked. He wasn't sure anymore. He was beginning to suspect that whether he pushed her physically was only part of the truth. The larger issue was that she had been trying to escape something intangible, something cumulative, and he had reacted not with curiosity but with resistance. She shifted carefully in the bed. "If I decide to leave after this," she said, "will you let me?" The question cut deeper than any legal threat. He felt his throat tighten. "I don't want you to leave," he admitted, "but I won't stop you." She studied his face again, searching for cracks in that promise. "That's what you said before," she reminded him. He had no defense for that. Silence settled between them again, heavy and unresolved. The future was no longer a shared assumption. It was a negotiation, and Daniel understood that even if she chose to stay, it would not be because he held her. It would be despite it. He sat there watching her breathe, aware that every word from this point forward could tilt the balance. If he clung too tightly, he would confirm her fear. If he withdrew too much, he might lose her entirely. There was no safe middle. Outside, footsteps echoed down the corridor again. Somewhere a monitor alarmed and was quickly silenced. Life continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside the room, the tension did not ease. It condensed. Maya finally closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. Daniel remained seated, staring at the space where her hand rested. He did not reach for it this time. He was beginning to understand that restraint might be the only proof he could offer. But restraint now did not erase the moment on the stairs. It did not erase the possibility that in a flash of panic, he had chosen control over safety. And as he sat in that sterile hospital room, he realized that the most terrifying part was not whether she remembered. It was that he might never fully know himself. He stayed until visiting hours ended again, not because she asked him to, but because leaving felt like admission. When the nurse gently told him it was time, he stood slowly, as if any abrupt movement would confirm instability. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. Maya nodded faintly, her expression unreadable. The distance between them was no longer physical, it was conceptual. Driving home, he turned off the radio. Silence allowed the replay to begin again. This time, he forced himself not to soften the edges. He saw her reaching for the door. He saw himself blocking it. He heard his own voice, lower than usual, saying, "You don't get to walk out like this." He saw her yank her arm. He felt his grip tighten reflexively, not violently, but insistently. And then there was that split second where he could have let go. That was the second he circled. Not the fall, not the impact. The decision to maintain contact when she tried to break it. He had not calculated harm. He had calculated victory. He had wanted to win the moment, to prevent her from having the final word. The rest had followed. He parked in the driveway but did not get out immediately. The house loomed ahead like a witness. He imagined explaining this realization to the officer. "I didn't mean to push her. I just didn't want her to leave." The sentence sounded pathetic and dangerous at the same time. Inside, the house felt altered, though nothing had physically changed. He walked up the stairs again, slower this time, feeling each step beneath his feet. At the top, he stood where he had stood that night. He placed his hand on the wall, roughly where her shoulder had brushed as she twisted away. He extended his other arm into the empty space, imagining resistance. "If I had let go," he said aloud, testing the counterfactual. "If I had let go." The phrase echoed. It did not absolve him. It indicted him differently. Letting go was an option. He had not chosen it. He walked into the bedroom and opened her closet. Her clothes hung neatly, a few gaps where she had packed and unpacked before. He touched the empty space between two hangers. It felt symbolic, like a preview of absence. He closed the door quickly, unsettled by how easy it was to imagine the closet half empty permanently. The next morning, he arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Evelyn was already there. She looked exhausted but resolute. She barely slept, Evelyn said. Headaches, Daniel nodded. How is she now? Thinking, Evelyn replied. The word carried weight. Maya was sitting up in bed when he entered. A slight improvement from the day before. Her eyes tracked him immediately. Not warmly, not coldly, just attentively. I had a dream, she said before he could speak. His stomach tightened. About what? He asked carefully. About falling, she replied. But in the dream, I wasn't pushed. I jumped. The statement startled him. Why would you jump? He asked. She shrugged faintly. In the dream, I wanted to escape. Not just the argument. Everything. He felt a sting in his chest. Escape me? He asked, trying to keep accusation out of his tone. She held his gaze. Sometimes it feels like you don't hear me unless I threaten to disappear. The honesty in her voice was steady. No hysteria, just clarity. He sat down slowly. That's not fair, he said, though the protest sounded weak even to him. I listen. She tilted her head slightly. You listen to respond, she corrected, not to understand. Evelyn watched silently from the corner, arms crossed. Daniel felt exposed, outnumbered. I'm trying, he said. The repetition of that phrase over the past months made it feel hollow. Trying had not prevented this. Maya looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about the moment your fingers tightened, she said. The specificity made his pulse spike. Do you remember that? He asked cautiously. She nodded faintly. I remember feeling pressure, not a shove, just pressure. And I remember thinking, he's not going to let me go. The words were quiet, but they detonated inside him. He leaned back, heart pounding. I didn't realize I was holding that hard, he said. The sentence was closer to confession than denial. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. So you were holding hard, Evelyn said flatly. Daniel's jaw tightened. I was trying to stop her from storming off mid-argument, he replied. I didn't think she would fall. The justification sounded thin in the sterile air. Maya closed her eyes briefly. That's the problem, she said. You didn't think. He had no response. Later that afternoon, the officer returned with a more formal demeanor. Mrs. Hale, he began. Have you recovered any additional memory? Maya looked at Daniel briefly before answering. I remember him grabbing my arm, she said slowly. I don't remember being pushed. Daniel exhaled almost imperceptibly. The officer nodded. Do you feel safe returning home when discharged? The question hung in the air. Daniel felt the weight of it press against his ribs. Maya hesitated. I don't know yet, she admitted. I need time. The officer scribbled notes. We may recommend temporary separation while the investigation continues, he said evenly. Daniel felt as if the floor had shifted beneath him. Separation? He repeated. It's standard in cases involving potential domestic conflict, the officer replied. For everyone's safety. The phrase safety felt loaded. After the officer left, Daniel turned to Maya. You don't actually want that, do you? He asked. The desperation in his voice was unfiltered. She looked at him steadily. I want clarity, she said. If that requires space, then yes. Space. The word that had haunted him for months. He felt the urge to argue, to insist they could fix this together. He swallowed it. Arguing now would only reinforce her fear. Okay, he said finally. The word felt like surrender. Evelyn's expression softened slightly, but not enough to signal trust. When Maya was discharged 2 days later, she chose to stay with Evelyn temporarily. Daniel helped carry her bag to the car. The act felt surreal. He was assisting in his own displacement. I'll call you, he said quietly as she settled into the passenger seat. She nodded but did not promise anything. Driving back to the empty house alone felt different this time. Not just quiet. Vacant. The absence was active. He walked through each room, noticing details he had previously ignored. The indentation on the couch where she usually sat. The mug she preferred in the cabinet. The faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the bathroom. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at his phone. No messages, no accusations, just silence. He realized that for the first time since the fall, he was alone with no immediate witness. No Evelyn, no nurse, no officer, just himself. He replayed her words again. I remember thinking, he's not going to let me go. That thought had formed in her mind before she fell, before impact, before injury. The fall had only confirmed a fear that already existed. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered other moments, blocking the doorway during arguments, taking her phone from her hand once to read a message she refused to show him, insisting on knowing where she was, not out of concern but out of anxiety that she might be planning departure. None of it had felt violent at the time. It had felt protective, necessary, but protection without consent can feel like confinement. He understood that now with painful clarity. His phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "I need to know something." His heart pounded as he typed back. "What?" The reply came after a long pause. "If I decide not to come back, will you fight me?" He stared at the screen. The honest answer was yes. He would fight for her. But he knew now that the form of fighting mattered. "I will respect your decision," he typed slowly. He erased it. He typed again. "I will try to understand." He sent it before he could edit further. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, her reply came. "That's not the same as letting go." He put the phone down without responding. She was right. Understanding was not surrender. He still wanted influence. Still wanted a chance to argue his case. That night, he dreamed again. This time, the staircase was endless. She fell, in slow motion, looking up at him as she descended. He reached out, but instead of catching her, he held onto the railing, watching. He woke with a jolt, heart racing. The next morning, he received a call from the officer. "We've reviewed the statements," the officer said. "Given the ambiguity, charges are unlikely at this time. However, the case will remain open, pending any new information." Relief washed over him, followed immediately by a different kind of dread. The absence of charges did not equal innocence. He hung up and sat in silence. No legal consequences, but relational ones remained unresolved. He wondered whether he would have preferred clear punishment, something concrete to atone for. Instead, he was left in uncertainty. Later that afternoon, Maya called. Her voice sounded steadier. "I've been thinking," she said. He braced himself. "About us?" he asked. "About me," she corrected gently. "I need to understand why I stayed so long when I felt small." He felt a flicker of defensiveness, but suppressed it. "You're not small," he said. "Not in my eyes." She sighed softly. "That's part of it. In your eyes, I'm everything. But in my own, I started to shrink." The statement cut deeper than any accusation of physical harm. He had not noticed her shrinking, or perhaps he had and mistaken it for closeness. "I don't want to be afraid of you," she said quietly. "Even if that fear is subtle." He closed his eyes briefly. "I don't want you to be," he replied. "Then something has to change," she said. "Not just apologies, not just promises. Real change." He nodded even though she could not see him. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. There was a pause on the line. "Be careful with that phrase," she said softly. "Whatever it takes can sound like control too." He felt the sting of recognition again. After they hung up, he sat alone in the house, aware that the path forward was no longer about proving he hadn't pushed her. It was about confronting the pattern that made the fall possible, the pattern of tightening when she tried to move away, of equating departure with defeat. He walked back to the staircase one more time. He placed his hand on the railing he had tightened days earlier. It felt firm now, stable. He looked down the steps and imagined her standing there again, turning to leave. This time, he imagined himself stepping aside. The image felt foreign, unnatural, but possible. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space, knowing that the next time she faced him with a decision that threatened his sense of control, the real test would not be whether he could argue. It would be whether he could release. And release, he was beginning to understand, might cost him more than the fall ever did. The realization did not arrive as a burst of enlightenment. It settled slowly, like sediment in water that had been violently shaken. He stood at the staircase long after the house grew dark around him, the only light coming from the small lamp in the hallway. The railing was firm under his palm, solid, reliable. He wondered whether he had ever offered that same stability to her, or whether he had mistaken intensity for devotion. The next morning, he did not call her first. That restraint felt unnatural, like resisting an itch. He kept his phone on the table and forced himself to move through the house without reaching for it. He made coffee and drank it slowly, noticing how loud the silence was. Every time he felt the impulse to text her, to ask how she was, to ask what she was thinking, he paused and examined the impulse. Was it care or was it control disguised as concern? By mid-morning, the phone finally buzzed. His pulse spiked immediately. It was Maya. "I have a therapy appointment this afternoon." The message was short, informative, not seeking input. He stared at the screen. His first instinct was to ask if he could join. His second was to ask what she planned to say. He typed neither. Instead, he wrote, "I hope it helps." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you're doing that." He pressed send before he could complicate it. There was no immediate reply. He placed the phone face down and sat back in his chair. The act of not intruding felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. He realized how accustomed he had become to being part of every process, every decision, every emotional shift she experienced. Her autonomy felt like distance, and distance felt like threat. He forced himself to leave the house. The air outside was cool, crisp. He walked without direction at first, just moving. As he passed neighbors, he felt their eyes linger a second too long. It was likely his imagination, but the awareness remained. He wondered how many of them had heard the arguments, how many had formed opinions. When he returned home hours later, there was still no message. The absence gnawed at him. He tried to imagine her sitting in a small room, recounting their relationship to a stranger. What version would she present? Would she describe him as volatile, as insecure, as dangerous, or would she soften the edges out of habit? His phone finally buzzed again in the early evening. It was a longer message this time. We talked about patterns, about how fear of abandonment can turn into attempts to control. She did not accuse him directly. She did not need to. He typed slowly. That sounds accurate. The admission cost him something. There was a long pause before her response came. The therapist asked me whether I felt safe expressing anger around you. His throat tightened. And what did you say? He typed. Another pause. Sometimes. The word sometimes echoed louder than any definitive accusation. It suggested unpredictability. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered times when her anger had unsettled him so deeply that he redirected the conversation entirely. He would bring up something she had done weeks earlier. He would shift the focus to her tone. He would escalate until her original grievance disappeared beneath his reaction. He typed again. I don't want you to ever feel unsafe. He stopped himself from adding with me. It was implied. Her reply came slowly. Feeling unsafe isn't always about physical harm. It's about whether my feelings can exist without punishment. The clarity of that sentence pierced him. Punishment. He had never struck her, but he had withdrawn affection. He had gone silent for hours. He had made her regret voicing dissatisfaction by turning cold and distant. He set the phone down and stood up abruptly, pacing the living room. The house felt smaller now, the walls closer. He realized that even in this space, he was confronting himself as if in a mirror he had avoided for years. Later that night, she called instead of texting. Her voice sounded steady, but tired. I'm not coming home this week, she said. There was no anger in the statement, just fact. I understand, he replied, though his chest tightened painfully. I'll give you space. The words felt deliberate, practiced. There was a pause on the line. It's strange, she said. Part of me misses you. Even now. The confession startled him. I miss you too, he said quickly. But missing you isn't the same as trusting you, she added softly. The distinction landed heavily. He swallowed. What would rebuilding trust even look like? He asked. He needed a framework. A plan. Something structured. It would look like you not trying to shape my decision before I've made it, she said. It would look like you tolerating uncertainty. He almost laughed at the accuracy. Tolerating uncertainty had never been his strength. I'll try, he said. The phrase felt fragile now. No grand declarations, no promises of whatever it takes. Over the next few days, their communication remained sparse but intentional. She attended more therapy sessions. He scheduled one for himself as well. The first session was uncomfortable. The therapist asked him to describe the moment on the stairs without minimizing or dramatizing it. I held on too long, he admitted. The words felt foreign in his mouth. I didn't shove her, but I prioritized stopping her over-stabilizing her. The therapist nodded slowly. Why? She asked. Because if she left, I felt like I would disappear, he said. The vulnerability in that admission startled him. And what would that disappearance mean? The therapist pressed. That I wasn't enough, he replied quietly. That I failed, he paused. That I wasn't in control. The therapist leaned back. Control can feel like safety, she said. But to someone else, it can feel like confinement. He nodded, absorbing the duality. When he left the session, he did not feel absolved. He felt exposed. But exposure was different from accusation. It was self-recognition. A week later, Maya agreed to meet him in a public park, neutral ground. He arrived early, sitting on a bench under a wide tree. When she approached, his breath caught. She looked thinner, paler, but steadier somehow. They sat side by side with a careful gap between them. How's your head? He asked gently. Better, she said. The headaches are less frequent. She turned to look at him. How's therapy? He exhaled slowly. Uncomfortable, he admitted, but necessary. She nodded faintly. They sat in silence for a moment, watching children play nearby. The ordinariness of the scene contrasted sharply with the tension between them. "I've been thinking about the staircase," she said finally. His stomach tightened, but he did not interrupt. "Not just the fall, the months leading up to it." He waited. "I don't think you meant to hurt me," she continued. "But I think you were willing to risk hurting me to avoid losing me." The sentence was calm. Devastatingly calm. He nodded slowly. "That's accurate," he said. Saying it aloud felt like stepping into cold water. She studied his face for any hint of deflection. Finding none, she continued. "I can't be with someone who sees my independence as threat." The statement hung in the air. "I'm working on that," he said, not as defense, as fact. "Working on it doesn't guarantee change," she replied gently. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." There was a long pause. Wind rustled through the leaves above them. Somewhere, a dog barked. "I don't know if I'm coming back," she said finally. The words did not explode. They settled. He felt his heart constrict, but he did not reach for her. He did not argue. "I know," he said quietly. She turned to him, surprised perhaps by the lack of resistance. "You're not going to try to convince me?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "I want you to choose freely," he said. The sentence felt like the hardest one he had ever spoken. She searched his face, looking for manipulation hidden in the phrasing. "And if I choose not to?" she asked. "It will hurt," he admitted. "But I won't stop you." The promise felt both liberating and terrifying. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "I wish it hadn't taken the fall for you to see this," she said softly. "Me too," he replied. They sat there for a long time without touching. The space between them felt intentional now, not hostile. When she finally stood to leave, he remained seated. "I'll call you," she said. He nodded. "Take your time." He watched her walk away, resisting the impulse to follow. The urge was strong, almost physical, but he stayed on the bench until she disappeared from view. That night, back in the house, he walked up the stairs one more time. He paused at the top, looking down. The image no longer replayed with the same intensity. It was still there, still sharp, but it no longer demanded revision. It existed as a consequence. He placed his hand lightly on the railing and then removed it. He stepped back from the edge voluntarily. His phone buzzed hours later. A message from Maya. "I'm not ready to decide yet, but I'm not closing the door either." He read it twice. There was no triumph in his chest, no relief, just a steady acknowledgement of uncertainty. He typed back slowly. "I understand. I'm here." He did not add anything else. He set the phone down and sat in the quiet house. The outcome remained unresolved, the future undefined, but for the first time, he did not feel compelled to shape it immediately. Upstairs, the staircase remained. Downstairs, the door remained unlocked. And in the space between those 2 points, he sat alone, aware that whatever came next would depend not on whether he could hold tighter, but on whether he could finally let go without forcing gravity to decide for him.